Hello everyone, this is Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So let's have a 420. I haven't had a 420 in a while. For those of you who are new to the channel, 420s are, I think it was last year around this time. And always check your sound. Always check your sound. If you guys enjoy what I'm putting down, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. Of course, you can always support the Patreon, Super Chat. So 420s. 420s are episodes that I think it was last year on 420. I was like, hey, let's celebrate the pot thing. And one of those things affiliated with pot are these kind of deep thoughts, just this kind of interesting, odd, quirky thoughts on all sorts of things. Usually these trend towards the metaphysical. It could be anything from aliens. It could be sometimes political, where those are somewhat edgy conversations. Personally, I like getting into the alien metaphysical consciousness stuff. And so that's where these things tend to trend. Some people don't like it. Some people do. I don't necessarily do this for the people that don't like it. If they don't like it, they don't watch the video. For the people that do, however, I enjoy talking about it, and this channel is just me. So that's kind of where this goes. So I always say blaze one if you got one. And suspend for the moment your current belief in anything, because I get these people who are somewhat dogmatic and don't necessarily can't see beside of their reality box. But is what it is. I try to get people to pry it open just a little bit, if only a certain amount of dissolution of thought for a period of time. This is one of those times, and these are those videos. So when you see 420 or hear 420, that's what it means. I started having a conversation with my wife yesterday about how reality, looking at the world, looking at our world, our physical matter reality, from a position not necessarily fully in the physical matter reality frame. Now, some people will be like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm making the point that consciousness is a little odd in the sense that you can observe reality in these kind of different frames. And there's some states, especially out-of-body states, where the people are somewhat distinct from it. Jesus Christ, that's so weird. I'm seeing stuff in the background. Where people are distinct and separated from their physical body, and yet they're still active, conscious, and aware, not using their physical inputs. Now, here's the thing. I usually make the case when I'm talking to my wife that I often feel a certain degree of frustration with having the conversation with her, because there's no stone. And what I mean by stone is oftentimes there's no stone. If something takes place, if a person has experienced something, then there is a stone that they can get to another point where they can at the very least see where the person is coming from. So a person who, like for example, say you've been in a war zone. If you're trying to explain something that's very particular to the point of somebody being in a war zone, that person may be a little bit beyond you, but seeing as you've been to that very specific point, you can kind of see where the person is. It's the same thing with this. If she's had some kind of mystical, odd, weird experience, then she could at very least see where I'm coming from. And when you haven't had it, it is hard to see it. Now, that being said, when you have, you can kind of see where somebody else is coming from. Now, in my case, my rule in this stuff is always, I need to be able to validate it. And what I mean is, I suspend a certain amount of belief in this or that until I can somewhat validate it. I've freaked myself out at times, fair enough, but I've had bizarre experiences going back to the time where I was a kid, and I would have likely been this kind of more of an atheist had I not had those experiences, which kind of tweaked my mind into a different position and makes me want to know. And in the pursuit of wanting to know, willing to do what it takes, be it meditation, be it odd stuff of saying, all right, they said this is how this takes place, and saying, okay, fair enough, I would grade you by your own rule book. And I have had bizarre experiences. Here's the thing. My wife and I went to this thing. It's called the Monroe Institute. The Monroe Institute was started by Bob Monroe. Bob Monroe used to have these out-of-body experiences that he didn't necessarily know where they were coming from, why he was having them. But at some point, when he stopped being freaked out about it, he started trying to learn more about it. He started investigating it, having certain scientists, I think it was Tom Campbell, I don't know the other guy, to actually experiment with him to understand what's taking place. And Bob Monroe used to categorize certain, he would call it focus points of reality. It's the most fascinating shit you would ever see. He would say, this is focus 12, this is focus 20, this is focus 11. Essentially, this tick of consciousness and the way that the person is looking at the world and looking at reality. And in many cases, in Bob Monroe's cases, being so adept at it because it was happening to him in this kind of unconscious way, where he could pivot back and look at the world. And some of the stuff he said is what I want to talk about. And I think it was the thing I was talking to my wife about when her ass started to glaze over. Looking at the world from the standpoint of something that goes beyond just the normal waking state of being. Bob Monroe made this point of saying that the planet is surrounded by this kind of static field. Like this field of consciousness of all of the people who are pretty much on the planet. And that there's an aspect of us that extends beyond just this kind of physical thing. And that aspect is perceived as this kind of static. Now, this is somewhat odd to try to get across of somebody looking at the world in this way, or looking at reality this way from this kind of third person perspective. It's like, how are you external from the reality in a sense? Here's the thing though. When I was pushing to have this take place, the OBE thing, I didn't want it to be from a dream state. I wanted it to be a conscious awareness of going. And oftentimes I would end up in these states in this kind of unconscious way where it's like, oh, holy shit, I'm here. Hey, let's have some fun and let's maneuver. But those things were always somewhat fleeting, and those things were not something that I could control. I think it was several years ago. I went on this crusade of, fuck it, I'm going to make this happen. And again, what I noticed, I hit a fear barrier, again, where you get to the point where it feels weird and it's terrifying because it feels weird. But to cooperate a little bit of what Bob Monroe is saying, make this point of the stone, a few things happen. I chastise myself, stop being a pussy, and just let it happen. Just go through the process. You get this weird separation from your body. And I know that sounds odd, but it's true. You end up in a state where your body senses go away. And as they go away, they get louder. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it's true. You feel like your heart is beating out of your chest. It feels like your heart is beating like 1,000 times a minute. And that by itself was freaking me out. Beyond that, you start hearing sounds. Now, the static that Bob Monroe is talking about when he's saying he's looking at the planet externally, you're hearing sounds. You're hearing it sounds like vacuum cleaners put to both of your ears. At the same token, it feels like your heart is beating out of your chest. And this immense surge of energy, this immense surge of sensation, even though your senses are literally going off, your body is just turning off. The catch to this is, it's keeping a conscious awareness at the point where those senses turn off. And what you find is, you still have senses. Those things are still there. Those things still exist. I was in this interesting spot that at the point where I solidified my will against this and just went with it, it was a few things that happened, but the hearing and everything else, the static and everything else, and the surge of energy and everything else from your heart center and just kind of exploding. My eyes were closed and I'm staring at the room. I'm staring at the ceiling. Like, imagine this situation where your body is off, but you are functioning and moving about and aware. You're aware. My eyes are closed, but I'm staring at the ceiling. you're hearing stuff, you're seeing stuff, even though you're not necessarily tuned in to this particular reality space. It's sad to say that I was so freaked out and cowardly here. I existed in that moment long enough to validate that that moment existed, if that makes sense. And I kept telling myself, don't think about some goon standing beside you, which at that moment you're actually thinking about something standing beside you. The thing is, in this particular reality space, I knew enough to know that thoughts are things, and that oftentimes people can create odd things that do bad things to them. But that's them creating those things. Those things don't really exist. But it's this thing of, it's weird, it's odd, but you're in a different state. My point to this is, Bob Monroe's perspective of the world when he's looking at the planet, and he's making this thing of saying the world looks like this and the world has this particular property associated with it. Bob Monroe is right. And yet, there's always this gap between my capacity to get it across, because just saying there's a static doesn't necessarily get across what that feels like, what that sounds like. And this idea of feeling, sense, and sound ends up merging into this thing of weird thing of a felt sense of sorts. And even you and the way that you perceive yourself is purely just based on the way that you perceive yourself. You have this residual image of yourself that, given time, would just kind of go away into this kind of point of consciousness. That shit is weird, but that shit is fucking awesome. And the beauty of it is, pretty much anybody can validate the experience. It is difficult to get the experience across, but the experiences can be validated. So, I'm giving this because I was having a conversation with my wife, and when I have conversations with my wife about this stuff, that she's interested, but she's interested maybe 8 years ago when I first told her about it, like if we were talking about it. But not necessarily in the moment of 8 years later or 7 years later, however long. I think we've been together for 7 years. So, let's see. So, weird things in the history of high fructose corn syrup. Oh God, what are you guys talking about? It's like the old Star Trek ship at warp 7.5 for about 5 minutes. Guy died from horrific injuries working for the Clinton corn. Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay, so we are off the rails. All right. Well, I will allow the people to be off the rails. Yeah, I don't have much to say about that one. I've had weird experiences with stuff like this. What was the other one? I'm trying to think of the other one. Tom Campbell. I wonder if I can get Tom Campbell on the show. Tom Campbell is a NASA physicist. Tom Campbell has, but he's become this kind of new age guru of sorts. He has a very interesting way of looking at the world, and he's studied this stuff with Bob Monroe, and he looks at all of this as you are essentially a machine, or this is a machine, and the projection of reality is from other. Now, he makes this point that this idea of machine and this idea of other and everything else, those things are so esoteric, it's non-physical, it's not necessarily in our frame of reference. It's like if you're playing a video game and the video game character is not, we're not in its frame of reference. It wouldn't necessarily know what we are. That video game character, even if that video game character were alive, would have no context of what it is to be in the sunlight. You can program it in all you want. You can only get to a certain degree of an approximation. How do you translate those things? Tom Campbell is awesome at this. Tom Campbell used to go into these, he doesn't necessarily always relay his experience per se, because he doesn't necessarily want to, he would say, influence other people's experience. But he definitely makes this case that this is a VR simulation. And by VR, don't take it literally. He just means it's projected in a certain way, with this idea of increasing the quality of the consciousness. He's rigid in this. I have a different suspicion. My suspicion is that the experiences that Campbell or anybody else will have would be subjective. that it's not going to be hard and solid. Ultimately, to some degree, the intent of the person is going to have, to some degree, a perspective or influence how the person perceives what that person is perceiving, if that makes sense. So Tom Campbell, rigid thinker, and I don't mean rigid in a bad way. I just mean he has this scientific approach to looking at the world. Even for this, he investigated it from the standpoint of a scientist, repeatedly, over and over and over again. But Tom Campbell can go into those states over and over again, and he comes back. This is a computer. The whole point is increasing the quality of consciousness, and this is a simulation, and spirit guides and angels are just simulations and all this stuff. But I strongly suspect that part of the reason that Tom Campbell comes away with that very particular rigid way of looking at the world is because Tom Campbell has somewhat of a rigid way of looking at the world. Like, I don't necessarily know if it's as solid as the way Tom Campbell makes it, but either way, whether I agree with him or not on it, he's fucking fascinating. I am going to see if I can get Tom Campbell on the show, because he would be an awesome person to talk about this stuff. He has a show himself that he gives these lectures. Yeah. I'm going to try to do that. So I'm going to end this here. I'm not going to keep this much longer. Thank you guys for showing up to this. Whoever showed up to this, I don't necessarily think we're getting a lot of people for it. But like I said, there's some of my audience that actually like talking about stuff like this. So I end it here. All right, guys. Have a good one. And